I'm Nicholas Barrett.
And I'm Guntram Wolff.
And you're listening to a very special episode of The Sound of Economics. Today we come to the Berlaymont building to talk to Margrethe Vestager, Executive Vice President of the European Commission for a Europe fit for the digital age. Ms. Vestager is also Commissioner for Competition and has made headlines by blocking mergers and imposing multi-billion euro fines against some of the world's biggest companies. In the years to come, her policies could define Europe's attitude to the internet, artificial intelligence, and in doing so, perhaps capitalism itself. Margrethe, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, welcome here in the Berlaymont.
Do you consider competition policy as a tool to reduce inequality?
It can work that way, yes.
How so?
Well, it's not a direct effect because obviously what we do with competition tools is make sure that customers can have the benefit of competition, which is affordable prices, quality, innovation. And if you have a marketplace that works like that, well, then it can have an indirect effect on inequality as well.
Well, I think what's interesting, Thomas Philippon has just published a book, The Great Reversal, in which he emphasizes how well European competition policy is doing compared to US competition policy and how much it has benefited European consumers, European households, and how much it has contributed to reducing inequality. So quite a success story for Europe we are seeing here.
Well, one of the differences we see is that the European market is not at all as concentrated as the US markets. And even though I think many people in this debate, they live quite comfortable lives, they're well off, for many people, it still means a lot what's the level of prices. Because if you're on a small budget, well, then it means something to you. What is the price of your daily necessities? What is the price of transportation? What's the price of heating, of electricity? So for me, this kind of old school thing about competition, that it also keep prices down, is still a very important aspect. That it also enables and provokes innovation, is of course what makes competition a very efficient and also very modern thing for a planet like ours.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a bit about China. China has, of course, different state aid and competition policies, as also pointed out in a recent non-paper by the Netherlands. Non-papers are usually the more interesting papers, I have to say. And the Netherlands proposes quite clear ideas on how to change European competition rules. Do we need to change Europe's rules, allowing European companies to actually grow and compete with the Chinese ones?
Well, this is a very specific matter because last spring we were going through a number of different issues, and one of the gaps we found was what happens if foreign state aid comes into Europe. Because we have very clear, advanced rules about state aid within Europe. Europe is not at all state aid free, but when you have state aid, it doesn't unlevel the playing field or make competition difficult. But what we saw was that when there is a risk of foreign state aid, then how do we deal with that? And that we have been working on ever since. And I think the Dutch proposal is quite thought through. I think it's very welcome that they put in resources to think with us how to deal with this, in order for us to present a new tool and a new enforcement sometimes later next year.
Speaking of the size of companies, obviously AI rewards firms who have the scale and the ability to harvest vast amounts of data which they can use to learn more about their customers and potential customers. This seems to be a theme in capitalism at the moment, just gaining as much data as possible and using it to completely dominate your rivals. Do you think AI will inevitably exacerbate the gap between large and small companies?
No, I think that AI will develop. And also I think that the use of data will develop. That it's not only for you who harvest a lot of data yourself to advance in AI, it's also for you who in clever ways pool data, share data, reuse data, use edge computing, where you don't necessarily store the whole thing, but you use it and then you get rid of it again. I think that artificial intelligence as a technology will develop so that it will also be extremely useful for companies who deal with data in a different way than a giant harvester would do.
At the moment, the incentive seems to be to hoard that data, keep it secret, and just use it to get even more data.
And another tendency would be that since everyone is told that data is so valuable, that you kind of think, well, since it's difficult to price, then how could I share it if I don't know the price? And then you don't share it, and then the price is zero, because then you get nothing, because your own amount of data may be too small, but what we actually could do together would maybe a sufficient and interesting amount of data to do AI. So the thing is that maybe instead of thinking about the value and how to maximize the value of data for yourself, then maximize the volume of data that you can access, and by then maximize the value of your own technology.
And do you think policy has to incentivize huge companies to do that, or do you think they have to be pushed a bit?
Well, I think both. Most good schemes, they work both with a push and a pull.
Mm. Well, there doesn't seem to be a lot of tech giants here in Europe, emerging in Europe. First of all, why do you think is that the case? And do you have a plan to change that? And if so, would it actually benefit European consumers if we had more of our own tech giants?
Well, I think the fundamental reasons why we don't have tech giants is sort of an old school reason. It's about the single market. Mm-hmm. Because it is as if we think of the single market as a thing we establish and then we have it. But for me, the single market is something that you maintain like a lawn. Because if you don't move your lawn like every week, well, weeds will crawl in. All of a sudden you have a small tree in a corner. You really have to work on it. It's always work in progress. And when you see both Chinese and US giants, they got a very strong foothold in their sort of native single market. Mm-hmm. And that we have failed to provide for European businesses. And that, of course, will have to be a top priority for this Commission to make sure that it works. If it will serve consumers well, I think that is an open question because that depends on the services. One of the things that we don't see much as consumers is sort of the business-to-business technology, because this is before we see sort of the end product. And here Europe has strongholds that are unappreciated. And that is part of what we should build on. That many European businesses, not being giant, but being very advanced in their technology, that could be put at better use.
Well, beyond the single market, other factors driving the emergence of these kind of bigger companies and stronger companies is certainly access to talent, top people, top universities, and access to finance. Now, the last Commission already emphasized many of these aspects. They emphasized the single market, they emphasized the single digital market, they emphasized capital markets union, improving access to finance, and there was also an emphasis on education and training. What will this Commission do differently to succeed and really make progress in this space? Well, the thing obviously is that it's not enough to emphasize. It has to be action on ground. Mm-hmm. And every Commission will have to build on the previous Commission. Otherwise, 5 years is just way too short a time frame. And I think the work done by my colleagues in particular in the Juncker Commission, this is an excellent starting point to do more. Because a lot of the debates has sort of paved the way for more coordinated action being taken. I think in particular when it comes to skills. Because skills and education have moved from being sort of a somewhat soft, yes, we can always, more education is a good thing, yada yada, to be, really hardcore, center stage. I think everyone now recognizes that without talent, without gifted people, well, you will never, ever be able to make it no matter how much money you throw after these issues.
And do you see it as the European Commission's job to invest, or is it something you see member states being more adapted to do?
Well, in education, obviously, these are member states' competence. So they definitely have the first thing to do here. But we have a skills strategy, and we will, of course, improve that strategy, both in the light of digital, but also in the light of fighting climate change. Because in a number of regions in Europe, there will be a giant need for reskilling and upskilling. For new businesses to move in to regions where you before would have sort of the main sector would be coal mines or energy generation by coal. So it's a different creature by now, because it's much more felt, I think, in every member state, the need to do this. When it comes to investment, what we see, for instance, in technologies as AI, is that member states invest very little. So it's very important to have European programs to do this, in order for us to be able to get the most attractive programs for some of the very sort of top-notch talents to do this.
Let's talk a bit about industrial policy and the link to competition policy, but also more broadly industrial policy. You're now, as an executive vice president, also somehow in charge of that area. And I have to say, from the outside, I find it quite difficult to discern really what is the overall strategy, what is the EU approach, what's the EU level action that is needed on industrial policy, what is the national action, and how to ensure that industrial policy is not just disguised subsidies to the incumbent companies that already exist. The recent example of a battery production facility that got clearance, state aid clearance, is a very major subsidy to a number of firms. And one wonders, well, what was the market failure? What is the gap here that this subsidy actually failed? And how to lead to an overall strategy on industrial policy that actually makes sense and that brings us forward. I find it quite difficult from the outside to discern these various elements. Perhaps you can walk our listeners through that.
Indeed. I very much like the project that we have on batteries. It is truly pan-European. Because it's a number of member states and it's a huge number of businesses who participate. And the reason why this is a good project is that sort of the development of next generation batteries is something that no individual business could take upon themselves, because the risk of that kind of investment is simply too big. Mm-hmm. And sort of the generation of batteries that we use now is very high consuming in very precious materials and resources. Mm-hmm. So we need to develop quite a number of things. We need to move to a new generation of batteries that use a different sort of resources or use resources in a different way. We need to develop a battery infrastructure, because we don't have this. And of course, we need to figure out, well, after a battery infrastructure have used and reused the batteries, when they're not fit for use anymore, then how to deal with the resources so that we can recoup them and reuse them in new batteries or in other products. And here we see that the market will not develop this for us, because the risk of the individual business is too big. But what you can get for when taxpayers sort of take part of that risk, because this is basically what you do when you give a public subsidy, is that you can then have a governance model that allows for the knowledge that is being created to be shared much more widely than what you would otherwise have. Because if you have a business who say, well, we will invest in this because the risk is the kind of risk that our owners would like us to assume, then, of course, it's for that business alone. And here we talk about knowledge and way of organizing things that are useful for every member state. Because it is highly probable that we will need a genuine sort of battery infrastructure for this to make any sense. Because otherwise, well, how can you make sure that we have not too many resources actually occupied in the batteries themselves, because we haven't bothered to sort of reinvent the way that we use them. And this is the rationale behind this kind of project, that you have governance so that knowledge can be shared. You have a shared risk-taking that actually make these projects take place. And you have a need that is a broad societal need for developing a technology that you would otherwise not develop. And I think that's a very sort of hands-on kind of industrial policy. Because the thing is that we do not have a gap of industrial policy. We have, I think, the Juncker Commission, we did too.
Right.
So it's not that we don't have industrial policies. No. The problem is that they are not seen as industrial policies, I think, to a very large degree, because they become words on paper instead of action on ground. And this is why, for me, a real industrial policy, first of all, it's for every business, because it cannot just be for what we call big business, because I think in my own country, there's only one. The rest of the businesses, they are in the category of small and medium-sized.
Sure.
So if the industrial strategy should be relevant, it has to be for all businesses. And I tell you, there are many businesses who are really relevant when you think about industry. And that goes for a number of member states, that the businesses in that member state, they are small and medium-sized. So it has to be for all to be relevant. Obviously, it has to be green, because you cannot have sort of Green Deal and then that not to color also industrial strategies. Sure. And obviously, it has to be based on fair competition. And one of the reasons why it has to be based on fair competition is that this is the most important driver to innovation. And strong industry is an innovative industry, because you can make any government program, you can make any investment in schemes with university or public-private partnership. If you do not have competition as a driver, sure, it will not happen.
Will not work.
Because you do not have a skin in the game. If there is not sort of this uncomfortable feeling that if I don't do something, my competitor will take over, well, you don't have the drive. And this is why this combination of research, innovation, public-private partnerships, projects like the battery project, and fair competition goes very well together, because you have the fundamental driver and you have the things that makes the risks bearable for the businesses that actually want to take part. And I think that is a very strong logic. And then when you have the demand from the European Green Deal of deployment of technology and the development of technology, then you also have a strong market pull for industry to engage. And for instance, if you look at the latest papers by the European Roundtable, they organize the biggest businesses in Europe, you'd see that is also a logic that then themselves have a buy-in to, especially because they also see the European Green Deal as a growth strategy. And I think that's a very strong logic that can make this sort of industrial strategy be a much more hands-on thing than what it may have been previously.
But do we need then an industrial policy strategy also for the digital sector more narrowly, and perhaps specifically for certain networks, network industries, for cloud computing, for areas where actually strategic value creation in the future might arise and might be dominated by, and where currently in some of these sectors, including 5G, there might even be some security concerns that giving access to 5G to foreign companies would actually undermine our security. So should we develop a very specific and targeted industrial policy for network industries, cloud computing, and 5G?
Well, 5G will have to be seen, I think, more as infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Of course, there are industrial interests here, also because you have a number of companies who are in the business of the hardware and the software of 5G. But I think one thing is important, and that is that we think about digitization and new technology as something that is in every sector. because you see sort of, for instance, the merge between the car industry and sort of the more native digital industries. Someone told me the other day that if you want to do automated driving, then of course you still need the energy for the car actually to move. But you also need the energy for the car to be the computer. And that in itself will be a challenge, because the use of energy when it comes to automated driving may be double what we use today. So that in itself is work in progress, because that of course cannot be allowed, because then what about fighting climate change? But it's a good example of how a very important European sector merges into a digital logic, which is why you have to say, well, sort of the automotive sector, they will also do platforms. They will also deal with data. They will also have engineers and sociologists and whatever it takes to understand how people relate to automated driving. And this is why I think it's very important not to say now we focus on something that we call the digital sector, because then we take the risk of not seeing how everything digitalizes. Agriculture is a very obvious example of digitization, but you see it in energy production, you see it in health, you see it everywhere you look.
Of course, we can take lessons from the old industry to apply to the new one. A lot of people think that Europe's approach to state aid has left a lot of post-industrial communities in Europe behind. And a lot of people think it's been unfair to them, and it's failed them in many ways. Can you have competition, true free competition, without creating whole communities of people who feel completely detached and abandoned by our political institutions? And if not, what can we learn from the past to apply to the future in this new digital economy?
I think it's very important not to make sort of state aids the enemy here, because what you can achieve with state aid is basically three things that are quite fundamental. First, that you don't spend more than you have to, because it's important to have the right solutions, but it's also important that you get them at the cheapest possible price. Second, that you do not crowd out private investment, because we really, really need private investment. And if you just have, the taxpayers take over, then you gain nothing. You just, sort of chased private investment out of the area. And last but not least, that you want to have a level playing field, because you want to have this drive from fair competition to make you innovate, to make you think about new things. And I think it's highly underestimated how much state aid we do hand out in Europe. It is such a big amount, I have forgot the number, because we're talking big money. And this is because that we can authorize state aid, because it serves specific purposes. For instance, transitioning into renewable energies. We have so many state aid schemes that serves that purpose. And we have sort of state aid schemes for assisted regions, where you would roll out broadband, for instance, because there may not be a private business idea, so you will support the rollout of broadband, which would otherwise not happen. And then, of course, you have sort of the very fundamental European solidarity with regions that are in trouble that comes from our cohesion funds, structural funds. So I think it is not the state aid rules that are the enemy here. It may be the way that funds are actually being used, that we do not see the integration of these regions in the right sort of horizontal and comprehensive way.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because over the last few decades, we've seen wealth, opportunity, and talent and economic growth seem to concentrate and cluster in certain areas of Europe. And of course, the European Union's redistributed lots of money and development to other places. But I mean, speaking as a kind of veteran of Brexit, it seems like that wasn't enough to give people faith in the project and the overall philosophy of competition.
But that I don't think that these two things are connected. I don't think that you can say that because of how the world is, people have not gained trust in competition. Because the thing with competition is that the pain is very concentrated, but the gain is very thinly felt by the many, many, many people. And it takes an overview to say, well, wow, what have we all gained by competition? Because obviously the people who feel the pain, they feel it very heavily. And that understandably, they would tell you about it. But I think what is essential here is, of course, to make sure that what we do not overburden sort of the individual instruments, but that we see the many different things that will have to come together. Because some of the trends, they are trends because what people want. I think in every member state, also in the very small member state that I come from, it takes literally 4 hours to go from Copenhagen to the West Coast. We have the same debates about cities versus rural areas as we have in member states when it takes, 4, 5, 6, 10 times the amount of hours to go from one end to the other. So there are trends and tendencies because of individual choices that you see in every member state, and that you cannot pin that on one instrument or one decision, but is something that we all have to deal with because policy is not everything. Societal choices and societal tendencies, they also come from individual choices that we all make.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager, for joining us today. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Well, then when we close so abruptly, that must be an obvious invitation to do this again.
Please, yes.
I'll be more than happy.
Thank you very much.
If you or any of our listeners do need to make a 4-hour trip across the length of Denmark anytime soon, I suggest you subscribe to The Sound of Economics, because we have lots and lots of episodes covering every topic. And I thought I'd get that plug in.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome.